Iran has bombed an American frigate as it was trying to sail through the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran says they've bombed it successfully with 2 different missiles. But as well as that, it comes at the same time that Iran has bombed the UAE and carried out 15 different missile strikes onto them. And there's a whole lot more as well that's happened in the last 24 hours. And that's what this is, a news recap covering all the news from the last 24 hours. And so here's everything you need to know that you've missed, and truthfully, it gets way worse. But first, Iran claims that they've bombed an American warship. This actually came before the strikes onto the UAE earlier today. Well, today, Iran's main state news agency came out and reported that a US warship was struck twice as it was sailing through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said they struck it, quote, after it ignored warnings from the Iranian Navy. Iran says that no US warships are allowed to sail through the Strait of Hormuz, or they will be attacked. However, Iran said that their attacks was so big that, quote, it was unable to continue its route due to the hits, and it was forced to retreat and flee the area. Now, these are some massive claims. If a US frigate has been bombed, the US would probably go to war over it. However, the US, as we kind of expected, has come out and completely denied it. They said outright, quote, no US Navy ships have been struck. US forces are supporting Project Freedom and enforcing the naval blockade on Iran. Now, it's worth knowing, though, that it came at the same time that something else was announced as well, and that was the US saying that 2 US destroyers successfully sailed through the Strait of Hormuz. Although the US did confirm that Iran tried to attack those 2 destroyers. Now, this was completely unrelated to the previous piece of news. However, this is arguably more important. These 2 US destroyers are the first American warships to sail through the Strait of Hormuz and into the Persian Gulf since the war in Iran started. That's simply because for the last 2 months, Iran has been threatening to bomb any ship that does this, but now the US has done it. The US said, quote, no US warship was struck, though Iran launched small boats, missiles, and drones against them. The US said, quote, the USS Truxtun and Mason, supported by Apache helicopters and other aircraft, faced a series of coordinated threats during the passage. And so this is the US acknowledging that Iran did try and attack those 2 US destroyers separately to the frigate that Iran claimed they bombed before that. Now, the US President Trump has previously said that if Iran ever tried to do this, which they now have, they would be, quote, blown off the face of the earth. And so maybe that's coming soon. But that kind of leads me into the next point that could lead into a bigger war anyway, and that is that now Iran has bombed the UAE again. I'm sure you've heard about this by now, but here's everything you haven't heard so far. Well, last night, Iran carried out their first strikes onto the UAE in nearly a month, since 8th of April. That's when the ceasefire was signed. Well, these strikes consisted of 12 ballistic missiles, 3 cruise missiles, which are more powerful, and 4 Iranian drones. Now, the UAE announced that they intercepted most of them. However, there was a successful strike onto an oil storage facility in the Emirates of Fujairah. And that strike, that Iranian strike, killed 3 Indian workers. Now, we don't know what the response is going to be from the UAE because of this, but it is also expected that because of these Iranian strikes, it suggests Iran is trying to restart the war now. And so we could be seeing the US and Israel carrying out their own new strikes on Iran over the next day or so. And so that would mean the restart of the war. Although I will say there is something else that you need to know, which leads me into the next piece of news, and that is that Iran has actually condemned these strikes on the UAE, even though they carried them out themselves. Now, to understand what I'm saying here, you have to understand the structure of the Iranian leadership. The Iranian army, unlike most countries where the government controls the military, is completely separate to the Iranian government. The Iranian army, the IRGC, pretty much acts of their own accord, even if it disagrees with what the Iranian government says. It's the Iranian government, according to anonymous Iranian officials, has actually condemned the strikes carried out by the Iranian military. The Iranian president reportedly said, quote, the attacks were completely irresponsible. And he also called the strikes on the UAE madness, and he warned of, quote, potentially irreversible consequences. And so the Iranian president, who's meant to be one of the main people in charge of Iran, has come out and said, according to anonymous officials, that he had no control over these strikes against the UAE. He apparently says these strikes against the UAE completely derail peace talks, which they do, and they risk a war restarting. which they do. However, he had no control and no knowledge of these strikes until after they took place, because the Iranian army worked together themselves doing this. And this actually threatens the idea of a civil war in Iran, simply because the government disagrees with the military and they're both acting independently. And you're never going to get peace with a country that is structured like that. And so they're just going to end up in war regardless. So that's pretty crazy in itself. However, it is possible that after the strikes on the UAE, the Iranian president might have called up the UAE on the phone and said, "I'm sorry, it wasn't us. We'll try to make sure it doesn't happen again." Totally a possibility. I actually think that probably did happen. So maybe the UAE might just condemn it and rule it off simply because it wasn't actually the Iranian government's decision. But there's still an awful lot more that you need to know. However, if you've learned something so far, then subscribe, because I cover the news every day, everything that's happened in the last 24 hours. I put a lot of work into bringing you these videos every day because I want you guys to stay up to date on everything. But one other thing that you need to know is actually before the Iranian strikes on the UAE last night, the US announced they carried out their own strikes onto Iran. Not necessarily onto Iran's mainland, but the US said that they struck an Iranian naval vessel. But not just one, 6. The US said, quote, "American helicopters were used to destroy Iranian small gunboats threatening commercial shipping." Iran uses small speedboats with machine guns attached to the front of them to scare off commercial ships to stop them sailing through the Strait of Hormuz. And so that's what the US is talking about in that statement. Well, Iran has come out and said that actually none of their naval vessels have been hit. And so they launched an investigation into what the US actually struck. Iran said, quote, "Following the false claim by the US that it had targeted 6 Iranian speedboats, since none of our combat vessels had been hit, we launched an investigation into the nature of the claim." And we now know what that investigation came back to say, and it's way more disturbing than we thought. Iran said, quote, "An investigation found that American forces had attacked 2 small boats carrying cargo from Oman towards Iran." And Iran said those American strikes onto those civilian boats carrying cargo killed 5 civilians. And so the US believed that they were attacking Iranian gunboats, when in reality it was civilian vessels. Of course, the US probably won't launch an investigation into this, but if they did, they'd probably come back at the same conclusion. A lot of the times when the US carries out strikes, it's simply drone pilots and fighter jet pilots looking through a camera that would show something that looks similar to something they've seen before. And that's the decision they make. A lot of these decisions are made off the cuff. They're not made with a bunch of intelligence backing them up. And so it's totally possible these were civilian craft, as Iran says, which were bombed. And then shortly after that, those Iranian strikes on the UAE came. And then hours after that, Iran claimed they bombed a US warship, etc. Everything kind of links into it. Obviously, it's everything in the last 24 hours. But that's all of the news on Iran, but there's still some really more important things that you need to know. We've gotten a lot more updates on things, and one of the main things which actually came out in the last 24 hours was a update on something that happened a few days ago. Well, a few days ago, you might remember, the US hijacked an Iranian oil tanker that was trying to deliver oil back to Iran, or sail back to Iran. It was trying to get through the US naval blockade against Iran, and it refused to listen to the Americans. The ship, quote, "failed to comply with the US blockade." And because of that, the US hijacked the ship. Now, they also detained the 22 crew members on board that Iranian ship, who were Iranian citizens. Now, we didn't know what the US was going to do with the ship or those Iranian citizens who disobeyed the American orders. Over the past few years, many times the US has actually arrested crew members for not listening to US warship demands. But these 22 crew members who were detained by the US were actually dropped off in Pakistan today. The US said, quote, 22 crew members held aboard the seized Iranian container ship have been evacuated to Pakistan. And so that was a surprise in itself, but we actually believe that the US gave back the oil tanker back to Iran as well, and they left that in Pakistan for them to have. Over the past few years again, the US has had a long history of just seizing oil tankers and keeping them for themselves, so we were very surprised to see this. Now, the US said they did this, quote, as a confidence-building measure by the US. And what the US means by that is they want to put trust back into the Iran-US relationship, which would maybe help with peace talks in the future. One of the main reasons for that is that obviously there's no trust at the moment between Iran and the US, and during the previous peace talks, the US launched their war. And so trust is at an all-time low between the two countries, obviously. And so the US gave back this container ship, or this oil tanker, might I say. I think it's a little bit counterintuitive, considering they just shouldn't have gone to war if they just want trust, but we move. But something else I bet you didn't know, completely separate, is that 2 US soldiers have gone missing in Africa in the last 24 hours. They were part of an operation in Morocco called African Lion. It's an exercise that takes place every year, and it involves countries. Those countries are Morocco, Ghana, Senegal, and Tunisia, and many other countries in the West. Now, we don't know where these 2 US soldiers have gone. Maybe they've been kidnapped, but there's a massive search and rescue operation taking place, including, quote, ground, air, and maritime assets, basically everything the US has available. Now, these African Lion exercises are the largest exercises that take place on the African continent every year. And the exercises are to, quote, strengthen interoperability among participants and to build readiness to respond to any contingencies in Africa and around the world. So the usual definition. We don't know where these 2 US soldiers are, although I'm sure we will find out if the US tells us over the next few days. So that's another reason to subscribe, because I'll keep you up to date on that too. But there's still more you need to know. Something quickly is that Israel has bought more fighter jets. They've bought an F-35 squadron and an F-15 squadron. Israel has reportedly spent $120 billion on buying those fighter jets. And that's not even the important part. Israel said they've done this to, quote, strengthen readiness ahead of a demanding decade for Israeli security. And they're being bought under, quote, immediate wartime procurement needs, meaning Israel's getting them much sooner than they normally would. Now, I want to focus on Israel saying a demanding decade. That would suggest that Israel is preparing for a 10-year war. Of course, it's too early to say that, and it's simply a quote from Israel, so maybe they misspoke or something, but it's still a very, very big thing to pick up on. Israel's expecting 10 years of national security threats, and so it suggests that they expect the war in Iran to restart at least in the future. Something quickly though, in the UK, another warship has been decommissioned, although this time it's not a formal decommission, it's just been taken out of service without anyone knowing. There's probably a good reason for that though, and I'll tell you that in a moment. This warship is HMS Iron Duke. It's one of our 6 only working frigates. Now, the ship was last at sea in October of 2025, and 3 years ago it came out of a service that cost the UK £103 million. Now, since that service 3 years ago, the ship has only been sailing for 16 months out of those 3 years. And so for every month that it was actually at sea sailing, it cost the UK £6.4 million, and that's not including the operational cost of actually running the ship. The UK spent £103 million to use the ship for just 16 months. That is a huge cost to the British taxpayer, and it explains why our country is so screwed. It's just one example of the Royal Navy failing again. But yes, so this ship, even though it came out of repairs 3 years ago, has now been decommissioned silently without anyone knowing, which leaves us with just 5 frigates remaining, although at any one time there's always 1 frigate that is under repairs, which means there's 4. However, the UK needs at least 2, but usually 3 frigates in the North Sea, protecting them and gathering information on Russian vessels in the Channel and things like that. I'm getting a phone call. Hello. So where was I? Oh yes, we have 1 frigate available for deployment at any time, because the rest are either in the North Sea or being repaired. And if that frigate, the only frigate we can deploy, is too far away from where we need it, then it means we don't have a frigate available. The state of the Royal Navy in the UK is embarrassing, especially compared to 1805. And finally, Russia and Ukraine have declared ceasefires. It's worse than it sounds. They're only 1-day ceasefires, and they already can't agree on what day that ceasefire is going to be. Ukraine wants the ceasefire to be today on the 5th of May to celebrate the victory of World War II. But Russia came up with the idea. They've done it every year for the last 4 years, and they want to celebrate it on the 8th of May, when Russia took control and defeated the Nazis in World War II in Europe. Putin gave the direct order, and they said all fighting will cease on the Russian side on the 8th of May. Putin said, quote, "We hope that the Ukrainian side will follow suit." Now, Zelensky said that he hadn't received a message by Putin, although he says that every year for the last 4 years, and the ceasefire has never held up for the last 4 years either. It's only for 1 day to celebrate World War II. However, Zelensky didn't like the idea of it this time once again. He said, quote, "Human life is incomparably more valuable than the celebration of any anniversary." Although he said it in quite a sarcastic way, kind of downplaying the importance of the World War II anniversary. Not a great look for him, to be fair. Although he did say, quote, "It's time for Russian leaders to take real steps to end their war." So they can't agree on when the ceasefire is going to be, so it probably won't happen. However, they've said they want it, both sides. They just don't know when. But if you've learned something, subscribe because I do these videos every day. However, what I covered yesterday is arguably more important. And that is that yesterday, Iran actually offered a 14-point peace offer to America. However, America rejected that, and then they said they're going to go to war, which explains why everything has happened today in the Middle East. And so to make sure you understand what led up to today, you have to understand the context to that, which is that peace offer that was made yesterday. And so to make sure you haven't kind of wasted your time watching this and you fully understand everything, click here to watch yesterday's video where Iran offered that peace deal. And if you have seen this, fantastic, you know everything. So come back tomorrow for the next daily recap where I cover all of the news from the last 24 hours.